I'll never forget the day Sarah walked into my gallery. It was one of those chilly, gray mornings in Hamburg when the fog wraps around the city, softening its edges and dulling the sounds of the busy streets. I was fussing over a new display, adjusting the lighting just so, when she appeared at the door. A striking figure, elegantly dressed, her dark eyes scanning the room with an intensity that both startled and intrigued me. I am Sophie and I own this small but respected art gallery. A haven I built with years of careful work and dedication. My husband, Mark, is a successful businessman. One of those ambitious types always looking to conquer the next venture. His world is sharply contrasted against the quiet beauty of mine. Our lives are comfortable, stable, and orderly. He's provided a life of luxury, and in return, I play the part of the perfect partner. But in that instant, as Sarah's gaze met mine, the world I'd so carefully curated began to feel fragile. She approached me with a quiet confidence, her every step graceful, almost studied. There was something about her presence that felt rare. Like she was more than just another visitor wandering through my gallery. She held herself in a way that suggested she knew who she was, a self-assurance that struck me immediately. I greeted her, my voice betraying a slight tremor I didn't expect. "Sophie, is it?" she asked, her voice low and warm. She must have seen my name on the wall by the entrance, in the understated font I'd chosen years ago. I nodded, a little surprised that she'd picked it up and used it so quickly. She extended a hand. "Sarah," she introduced herself, her lips curving into a small, enigmatic smile. When our hands met, her grip was firm yet gentle, her skin cool against mine. There was an odd spark in that touch, something I felt before I even knew what it was. Over the course of her visit, she moved through the gallery with an almost hypnotic poise. She had an effortless way of drifting from one piece to the next, her gaze lingering on each artwork, seemingly lost in thought. Occasionally, she would make a soft, appreciative noise, a small nod, a slight smile, her gestures almost as expressive as the paintings themselves. She exuded an aura of someone who understood art deeply, someone who lived in its subtlety. But it was more than her appreciation for the art that fascinated me. There was something deeper, an undeniable allure that felt electric, drawing me to her. When she paused in front of one of my favorite pieces, a deeply emotional abstract work, she turned to me, her eyes catching mine. "This one," she said softly, "it's breathtaking. So complex, so raw." Her voice had softened, and there was a vulnerability there that mirrored my own. I found myself searching for the right words, but the intensity of her gaze left me feeling oddly exposed, as if she could see through the carefully built walls around me. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. It's a personal favorite." My heart was racing and I couldn't understand why. I was used to clients admiring the works, but Sarah's presence stirred something new within me. I felt alive in her gaze, seen in a way I hadn't been in years. Over the next few weeks, she began to visit the gallery regularly, each time with that same quiet grace, always lingering just a little longer than necessary. I told myself it was her appreciation for the art that kept bringing her back, but I knew somewhere in the depths of my heart that it was more than that. Our conversations grew longer, each word seeming to strip away layers I hadn't realized were there. It was during one of these visits that she invited me to coffee. It was such a simple offer, but the suggestion hung between us, heavy with unspoken possibilities. I hesitated, thoughts of my life with Mark flickering through my mind. But against all reason I agreed, and found myself eagerly anticipating our meeting. At the cafe, away from the gallery's quiet solemnity, Sarah seemed different, more relaxed, her laughter quick and bright. We talked about art, about life, and gradually about more personal things. She spoke of past loves, of heartbreaks, of dreams she had let go. I listened mesmerized, feeling as if I'd known her forever. And then, on an impulse that both terrified and thrilled me, I found myself sharing parts of my life I'd long kept hidden, even from myself. I spoke of the monotony of my marriage, of the strange emptiness that had grown between Mark and me over the years. I told her about the quiet moments when I'd lie awake at night, wondering if this was all there was. I had never voiced these thoughts before, and as the words left my lips, I felt both relief and guilt. Sarah listened intently, her gaze never wavering, her hand reaching across the table to cover mine. The gesture was simple, yet intimate, and for a moment, the noise of the cafe faded away, leaving just the warmth of her hand on mine. My pulse quickened and I felt that same spark as before. Only now it was undeniable, filling the space between us with a potent energy I couldn't ignore. That night, lying next to Mark in bed, I felt as if I were living a double life. The man beside me, with his familiar breathing and reassuring presence, had been my world for so long, but suddenly, he felt like a stranger. My thoughts drifted to Sarah. The way her touch lingered on my skin, the way her laughter had lit up the room. I was trapped in a web of contradictions, torn between the security of the life I had built and the thrilling unknown Sarah represented. The days passed in a blur, each meeting with Sarah intensifying the emotions swirling within me. I knew what was happening, and yet I was powerless to stop it. I craved her presence, her touch, the warmth of her gaze. She had awakened something inside me, a part of myself I hadn't known existed, a depth of feeling that both exhilarated and terrified me. One evening, as we were closing up the gallery together after a late showing, I found myself standing too close to her, our bodies separated by only a whisper of space. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and in that moment, the walls I had built around myself crumbled. I leaned in and she met me halfway, her lips soft and warm against mine. It was a kiss that shattered every rule, every promise, every expectation. It was as if the world had shifted, leaving only the two of us suspended in that fleeting moment. Pulling away, we stood there, the weight of what we'd done settling between us. I knew then that my life had changed irrevocably. I couldn't go back to the way things were, couldn't ignore the feelings Sarah had stirred within me. Yet the road ahead was filled with questions and uncertainties about my marriage, my identity, my future. For the first time in my life, I was faced with a choice I never thought I'd have to make. Stability or passion? Security or self-discovery? Mark or Sarah? The days following that night became a strange, surreal dream. I moved through my life with a sense of disconnection, as though I were only half present in each moment. My routines with Mark continued as usual. We shared dinners, spoke about his work, even laughed at the small things. But somewhere beneath the surface I was somewhere else, my mind replaying every touch, every stolen glance, every word I had shared with Sarah. And as if we were caught in some unbreakable pull, Sarah and I continued to meet, each encounter building on the last, each kiss, each look, each whispered word binding us closer together. In the gallery, over coffee, and sometimes even daring to meet at hidden spots around Hamburg, quiet parks, tucked-away cafes, places where no one knew us. Places where I could be the woman she saw in me, not the perfect, polished wife I'd been for so long. Our conversations became deeper, our silences heavier, each one loaded with unspoken desires, with questions that neither of us was brave enough to ask outright. And though we never spoke directly about Mark, there were times when she looked at me with a trace of sadness, as if she knew the price of what we were doing. As if she knew that this couldn't last forever, that our world was on borrowed time. Yet neither of us could bring ourselves to pull away. One rainy afternoon, as we sat in her apartment, the rain tapping against the windows, soft jazz playing in the background, I felt the weight of my double life pressing down on me. Lying in her arms, enveloped in her warmth, I let my guard down. She stroked my hair softly, her fingers tracing light patterns against my skin, and in that gentleness, I felt my heart breaking open. "Sophie," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion, "are you happy with him? Really happy?" Her question lingered in the air, the answer caught in my throat. I had asked myself this 1,000 times, had tried to push away the doubts, to ignore the restless ache inside me. But now, under her gaze, I couldn't pretend anymore. "I don't know," I whispered, the words barely audible, as if speaking them aloud would shatter everything. "I don't think I've even thought about happiness in years. I think I just accepted things as they were." She held me closer, and I felt the safety of her presence wrap around me, a comfort I hadn't known I needed. In that moment, a tear slipped down my cheek, and before I knew it, I was crying, all the pent-up emotions of years spilling out. Sarah held me, letting me unravel, never saying a word, just being there, steady and constant. The days passed, each one adding a new layer to the tangled mess of emotions that had become my life. With Sarah, I felt alive, seen, understood in a way I'd never felt with anyone else. She saw through my polished exterior, saw the parts of myself I had kept hidden even from myself. And yet, every time I returned to the home I shared with Mark, the weight of my decisions grew heavier. Mark, oblivious to the storm raging inside me, continued as he always had. There were moments when I would catch him looking at me with a tenderness that broke my heart. He couldn't know about the other world I had created, the other life I was living with Sarah. The guilt gnawed at me, yet it wasn't strong enough to make me stop. I was caught in a spiral, unable to let go of either world, pulled in two directions by love, loyalty, and a desire for freedom I hadn't known I needed. One evening, after a particularly intense day with Sarah, I returned home to find Mark waiting for me in the kitchen, a bottle of wine open on the counter. He smiled, gesturing for me to join him, his eyes warm and familiar, and for a moment, the weight of what I was doing hit me with full force. I felt like a stranger in my own home, the warmth of our shared life suddenly feeling distant and out of reach. As he poured us each a glass, he reached out, brushing a stray hair from my face. His touch was gentle, but it felt foreign, as though I were watching from a distance. I tried to match his warmth, to reach out to him in the way I once had, but my heart was somewhere else. With Sarah. My mind raced, my thoughts tangling in a mess of emotions that I couldn't sort out. Over the next few weeks, things between Mark and I began to change. He could sense my distance, though he didn't know its cause. His attempts to connect with me grew more desperate, his gestures more thoughtful. He planned weekends away, dinners at our favorite restaurants, even took an interest in the gallery, something he'd never done before. And though I appreciated his efforts, each one only served to remind me of what I'd found in Sarah. A freedom, a passion, a sense of myself that I had lost over the years. One night, after a long dinner with Mark, I found myself walking alone by the river, the lights of Hamburg reflecting off the water, casting the city in a surreal glow. The cold air bit at my skin, yet I didn't feel it. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, thoughts of Sarah, of Mark, of the life I was risking. I knew I couldn't go on like this forever. I would have to make a choice, either end things with Sarah or risk everything for a future that was far from certain. But how could I choose? How could I let go of the life I had built, the man who had been by my side through so much? And yet, how could I turn my back on the part of myself that Sarah had awakened, the woman I was only just beginning to discover? The days stretched into weeks, each one filled with a growing sense of urgency, a quiet desperation that haunted my every step. I would wake in the early hours lying next to Mark, my mind filled with memories of Sarah, the weight of my choice pressing down on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything changed. One evening, as Sarah and I walked along the river, our hands brushing against each other in the cool night air, she stopped abruptly, turning to face me, her expression unreadable. "Sophie," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being just part of your life. I want all of you or none of you." Her words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I knew she was right, knew that she deserved more than the half-life I had been offering. But the thought of losing her, of returning to a life without her presence, felt impossible. Tears filled my eyes and I reached out, gripping her hand as if holding on to her could keep the world from crumbling around me. "Sarah, please," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to choose." She looked at me, her gaze filled with a heartbreaking mix of love and sorrow. "Then maybe I have to choose for you," she replied softly. And with a gentle squeeze of my hand, she pulled away, turning to walk down the path, her figure slowly fading into the darkness. I stood there, frozen, the cold seeping into my skin, the weight of her absence settling over me like a heavy shroud. The days after Sarah walked away felt like I was floating in a strange, endless limbo. She had been so close, a part of my every thought, my very heartbeat. And now she was gone, leaving a hollow ache that I couldn't shake. I'd returned to the gallery, her absence echoing in every quiet corner. The art on the walls somehow duller, less meaningful without her sharp eyes and soft voice beside me. Mark noticed my sadness, though he assumed it was just the pressure of work, a passing mood. He tried to console me in his usual way, weekend trips, fine dinners, flowers sent to the gallery. But his kindness only amplified the distance between us, reminding me of the deep connection I had experienced with Sarah, of the woman I had begun to become in her presence. In her arms I had felt awake, alive. Now everything seemed dimmed, shrouded in a layer of gray, as if the color had been drained from the world. My days blurred together. Mornings were the worst, waking to the realization that she was really gone, that our world together, beautiful but fragile, had shattered. I would catch myself reaching for my phone, wanting to text her, to ask her to meet for coffee, to hear her laugh just one more time. But each time I stopped myself, remembering the finality in her voice that last night by the river. She had given me an ultimatum and I had failed to choose. I had let my fear paralyze me, and now I was left alone with the aftermath of my indecision. One evening, several weeks after Sarah left, Mark and I attended a gala. A large, glamorous event he had insisted on, hoping it would lift my spirits. The lights were bright, the laughter and conversation flowing around me, but I felt numb, isolated within my thoughts. The gallery's reputation had drawn a crowd that night, and I was introduced to numerous potential clients and collectors, smiling and nodding on autopilot, my mind elsewhere. And then in the midst of the crowd I felt a familiar presence, a pull that made my heart stop. I turned and there she was, Sarah. She stood across the room, her posture elegant and calm as always, her gaze drifting over the people around her until, as if drawn by some unseen force, her eyes found mine. The air left my lungs. For a second it was as if no one else existed, as if the world had fallen away, leaving only us in that crowded, buzzing room. Her face was unreadable, her expression giving nothing away. And yet in that gaze I felt everything, the longing, the regret, the love we'd left unfinished. Mark, sensing my distraction, followed my gaze. I quickly looked away, my heart pounding as I struggled to maintain my composure. He turned back to me, his brow furrowed, concern in his eyes. "Are you okay, Sophie? You look pale." "Yes," I murmured, managing a strained smile. "Just a little warm in here, that's all." But even as I said it, I knew it was more than that. My world had just split open again and there was no ignoring it. The evening dragged on, each second stretching painfully as I fought the urge to go to her, to speak, to say all the things I hadn't been able to say that night by the river. At one point I excused myself, needing a moment to breathe. I found a small terrace outside, where the sounds of the city filled the quiet. I leaned against the railing, the cool air brushing my face, steadying my nerves. But before I could gather my thoughts, I heard a soft, familiar voice behind me. "Sophie." I turned, and there she was, standing just a few feet away, her expression as conflicted as mine. For a moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us filled with all the words we hadn't said, all the feelings we'd held back. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think I could bear it, to be honest." "Neither did I replied, my own voice trembling. "But seeing you now, I don't know what to say." She took a step closer, her gaze searching mine. "Maybe there isn't anything to say. Maybe it's too late for that." I felt a pang of regret so sharp it nearly took my breath away. "Sarah, I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to let go of everything. I was so afraid." She nodded, her eyes softening, though I could see the hurt still lingering there. "I know. I could feel it. And that's why I had to walk away, Sophie. I had to protect myself. I couldn't be a shadow in someone else's life." Her words struck me with a force I hadn't anticipated. She was right. I had kept her on the periphery, never fully committing, never choosing her. I had let my fear keep her at arm's length, and in doing so, I had lost her. But what if? I began, my voice barely above a whisper. What if I made the wrong choice? What if I do choose you, Sarah? What if I walk away from everything else? Her eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. But then she shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "Sophie, you can't say that here in a moment like this. I don't want to be a decision you make on impulse, out of guilt or regret." Her words cut deep, and I realized she was right. I had to be sure for both of us. I couldn't keep coming back to her only to retreat again. I had to either step fully into the unknown with her or let her go, for both of our sakes. "I understand," I said quietly, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. "I'm sorry, Sarah. For everything." She reached out, her hand brushing mine, and in that touch I felt a goodbye, a finality that left a hollow ache in my chest. "Goodbye, Sophie," she murmured, her voice filled with the tenderness that had drawn me to her in the first place. "Take care of yourself." I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the cool night air, the sounds of the gala fading into the background. I stood there, staring after her, the weight of her absence settling over me like a shroud. In the days that followed, I threw myself into the gallery, into the art, trying to fill the void she had left. Mark continued to be there, as constant as ever, and I began to appreciate his quiet strength, his unwavering support, even as I struggled to find my own peace. But the memory of Sarah lingered, haunting me in quiet moments, reminding me of the woman I had been with her, the possibilities I had glimpsed. I knew that, in some ways, I would never be the same. She had left her mark on me, had opened parts of myself I hadn't known existed, and though she was gone, her presence would remain, woven into the fabric of who I had become. And perhaps, in time, I would find a way to move forward, to reconcile the different parts of myself, to find a new balance. But for now, all I could do was live with the memories, carrying them with me as I navigated the life I had chosen. A life forever changed by a love that had come and gone, leaving behind both pain and beauty in equal measure. Months drifted by, each one feeling both painfully long and frighteningly fast. The rhythms of my life resumed, and on the surface everything appeared normal, perhaps even better than before. Mark was attentive, supportive, and our relationship in many ways deepened. We had always been compatible partners. After all, we shared similar ambitions, similar tastes. I tried to be grateful for his constancy, for the stability he brought into my life. Yet, in the quiet moments, Sarah's presence lingered. I'd catch myself staring at a piece of art in the gallery, remembering her insightful comments, her gaze, the way her touch would ignite something wild within me. When I was alone, it was almost as if I could still feel her fingertips on my skin, hear her low voice, the warmth in her laughter. Sometimes I even reached for my phone, wanting to call her, to see her name on the screen just one more time. But each time I stopped myself. I couldn't break the silence between us. I knew that to do so would risk unraveling whatever piece I had managed to rebuild. Mark and I continued forward, and in time I found a fragile sort of calm. I poured myself into my work, arranging new exhibitions, meeting artists, and diving deeper into the gallery's world. Art had always been a passion, and now it became my sanctuary, a place where I could channel the emotions that swirled within me. I began to commission more pieces, reaching out to young artists with bold, challenging ideas, as if hoping that, through them, I could find some clarity, some truth I hadn't been able to find in my own life. One day, as I was setting up a new exhibit, I received a call from an old friend who owned a gallery in Berlin. She was organizing an art festival and wanted me to be involved, to present a collection from my gallery. I accepted, eager for the distraction, and threw myself into the preparations. The project demanded my full attention, filling my days and nights with a whirlwind of activity. It felt good, fulfilling even, to be part of something new, something that had nothing to do with my complicated feelings. The festival arrived, and the gallery was bustling with visitors, critics, and artists from all over. The energy was palpable, and I felt a spark of excitement that I hadn't felt in a long time. I moved through the crowds, discussing the art, the stories behind each piece, and for a while I was able to lose myself in the work. I felt almost like my old self again, strong, focused, in control. But then, late in the evening as the festival wound down, I spotted her. Sarah. She was standing in front of one of the pieces I had brought from Hamburg, her back to me, her posture as poised and graceful as ever. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if the universe had conspired to bring us together again. For a brief moment I considered slipping away, pretending I hadn't seen her. But some invisible force drew me forward, and before I could stop myself, I was standing beside her. Sophie. Her voice was soft, and though she hadn't looked at me, I knew she had sensed my presence. Sarah. I struggled to keep my voice steady, my heart racing as I looked at her, drinking in the familiar lines of her face, the warmth in her dark eyes. We stood in silence for a moment, both of us looking at the painting in front of us. A swirling abstract of deep blues and greens, filled with a restless energy that seemed to echo everything I felt. She glanced at me, her eyes searching as if she too were looking for answers in the art. I didn't expect to see you here, she said finally, her voice tinged with a sadness that struck a chord in me. But I suppose it was bound to happen eventually. I nodded, swallowing the knot in my throat. Yes. Life has a way of bringing us back to things we thought we'd left behind. She looked down, her fingers brushing over the edge of the frame, and I couldn't help but notice the faint tremor in her hand. I wanted to reach out to comfort her, but I held back, unsure of where we stood now. So much time had passed, yet standing beside her felt as familiar as breathing. "Sophie," she said softly, her gaze still fixed on the painting, "do you ever think about what could have been?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said, everything we had left unresolved. I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar ache in my chest, the longing that had never truly faded. "Every day," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not a day goes by that I don't think of you, of what we could have had. But I couldn't let go. I was afraid. And I lost you because of it." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing my words, then turned to face me. "I loved you, Sophie. I loved you so much that it scared me. And I knew that if I didn't walk away, I would lose myself in you, in us." Her honesty cut through me, raw and piercing, and I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. I reached out, hesitating, then took her hand, feeling the familiar warmth, the softness of her skin. She didn't pull away, and for a brief, fleeting moment, it felt like nothing had changed, like we were back in those quiet moments at the gallery, wrapped in the world we had created together. "I still love you, Sarah," I confessed, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I don't know if that will ever change." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and something else, something that looked like hope. "Then why couldn't you choose me? Why couldn't you let go?" Her question, though gentle, struck me with a force I hadn't expected. I wanted to answer, to explain the confusion, the fear, the guilt that had held me back. But as I looked into her eyes, I realized that there was no answer that would ever be enough, no words that could undo the pain we had caused each other. Instead, I pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling the warmth of her body against mine, the steady beat of her heart. For a long time we stood there, holding each other, the world around us fading into the background. I closed my eyes, savoring the feeling, knowing that this moment was likely all we would ever have. When we finally pulled apart, there was a clarity in her gaze, a resolve that both comforted and terrified me. "Sophie," she said softly, her hand lingering on my cheek, "you need to find peace within yourself. I can't be the answer to your questions, not anymore. But I hope you find what you're looking for." With those words, she pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead, a farewell that felt both tender and final. And then, before I could say anything, before I could hold on to her just a little longer, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I watched her go, my heart heavy, yet strangely light, as if something had been lifted. She was gone, but in her absence she had left behind a gift. The freedom to finally confront the parts of myself I had kept hidden. The courage to face my fears, to seek a life that felt true to who I was. In the weeks that followed, I returned to Hamburg, but something had shifted within me. I began to make changes, small at first, a new layout for the gallery, a shift in the artists I chose to represent. I even found the courage to have an open, honest conversation with Mark, to confront the parts of our relationship that had grown stagnant, to share my hopes, my fears, my dreams for the future. It wasn't easy, and at times the weight of the past threatened to pull me back, to cloud my vision. But each time I remembered Sarah's words, her quiet strength, the love we had shared. And slowly, I began to find my own path, one that honored the woman I had been with her, while allowing me to become the woman I was meant to be. In time, the memories of Sarah became less painful, though they never faded entirely. She had been a part of my life, a part of me, and in some ways she always would be. But now, instead of longing, I felt gratitude. A quiet, enduring appreciation for the love that had changed me, for the woman who had shown me parts of myself I had never known. And as I stood in my gallery, surrounded by art that spoke to my soul, by a life I had rebuilt on my own terms, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. I had loved and lost, had faced the depths of my heart, and in the end I had found myself. For the first time in a long time I was whole. As time went on, my life gradually settled into a new rhythm. It was as if I had shed an old skin, leaving behind fragments of the person I had been with Sarah, and emerging, slowly but surely, into someone more honest, more complete. My gallery flourished, drawing in a new wave of clients and artists, and I found myself taking risks I wouldn't have dared before. Curating bolder pieces, arranging installations that stirred intense, often controversial reactions. I poured my emotions into every piece I selected, every display I organized, transforming the gallery into a reflection of the inner journey I'd undergone. Mark and I, too, began to evolve together. After our long conversation, he seemed to recognize that something in me had changed. He became more attentive, more curious about the parts of my life he had often overlooked in the past. He even began attending art events with me, engaging with the work and the people in ways he hadn't before. For the first time, we weren't just two people bound by routine. We were truly learning about each other again, rediscovering parts of ourselves that had been buried under years of familiarity. And yet, despite the progress, I still felt Sarah's presence, like a whisper in the back of my mind. There were days when the memory of her would catch me off guard. A song playing softly in a cafe, a woman's laughter echoing down a quiet street, a familiar shade of dark lipstick. I would find myself smiling at those moments, a soft, bittersweet smile, knowing that she had been an irreplaceable part of my life, a chapter one would forever cherish. Then, one rainy afternoon, several months after the festival in Berlin, I received an unexpected letter at the gallery. It was a plain envelope, unmarked except for my name written in a familiar looping script. My heart raced as I recognized Sarah's handwriting, a flood of memories surging up in response. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling slightly, and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was brief, and yet it carried the weight of everything we had been to each other. She wrote that she had moved to Paris, following an opportunity to curate at a renowned gallery there. She spoke of her new life, her excitement, and her hope for a fresh start. But it was her closing words that struck me the most. "I don't regret anything, Sophie. Not the time we shared, not the love that we were brave enough to explore. It changed me, and I hope in some way it changed you too. I'll carry a part of you with me always. Take care of yourself, and remember that you deserve every bit of happiness you find. Love always, Sarah." Tears filled my eyes as I read her words, a strange mixture of joy and sorrow washing over me. She had moved on, found a new life, a new beginning, and in her own way she had given me permission to do the same. Her letter felt like a final loving goodbye, a closure I hadn't realized I needed. Inspired by her words, I decided to embrace the parts of my life that I had once neglected. I began taking art classes myself, dabbling in painting and sketching, expressing the feelings I couldn't put into words. Through the strokes of paint on canvas, I felt a catharsis, a release of emotions that had been stored away, hidden beneath layers of obligation and responsibility. It wasn't long before my work caught the attention of a small, local gallery, and they offered to feature a few of my pieces in a community showcase. I was hesitant at first, feeling exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. But then I remembered Sarah's quiet courage, the way she had encouraged me to explore the depths of my own desires, my own needs. And so, with a trembling heart and a hopeful spirit, I agreed. The night of the showcase was surreal. Friends, fellow artists, and even Mark attended, filling the space with laughter and admiration. I wandered through the room, observing the reactions to my work, feeling an overwhelming sense of fulfillment and pride. These pieces weren't just art. They were a testament to everything I had been through, a story of lost love, and the strength I had found within myself. At one point, as I stood in front of a particularly vulnerable piece, a storm of blues and grays, tangled lines and fierce brushstrokes, I felt a warm hand slip into mine. It was Mark. He looked at the painting for a long moment, then turned to me, his eyes soft. "I had no idea you had this inside you, Sophie," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and tenderness. "Thank you for sharing it with me." I looked at him, feeling a rush of gratitude and something deeper, something close to love. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, not as a wife, not as a businesswoman, but as myself, as Sophie. I squeezed his hand, and in that moment I realized that maybe, just maybe, we had a chance at building something new together, something real and meaningful. In the weeks that followed, I allowed myself to embrace the life I had, appreciating the beauty in the everyday moments that I had once overlooked. Mark and I began spending more time together outside of work and social obligations, exploring parts of the city we had never visited, sharing long conversations that stretched into the early hours. We were still learning, still navigating the scars left by the past, but there was a quiet hope between us, a willingness to rebuild. One evening, as we strolled along the river, Mark turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Sophie, have you ever thought about expanding the gallery? I know you've put so much of yourself into it, and I can see how much it means to you. Maybe it's time to take it to the next level." His suggestion took me by surprise, but as I looked at him, I saw the sincerity in his eyes. He wanted to be part of my dreams, to support me in a way he hadn't before. And in that moment, I realized that this new chapter of our relationship was just beginning. A chapter rooted in mutual respect, understanding, and a love that had been tested and had survived. With his encouragement, I began researching opportunities to expand the gallery, considering locations in Berlin and Paris, cities where I had felt the spark of inspiration. I threw myself into the project, and over time the idea of a second gallery began to take shape. It was a thrilling, terrifying endeavor, but I felt ready, confident in a way I hadn't before. Months later, on a bright autumn day, we opened the doors to our second gallery in Paris, a space filled with vibrant, daring works that reflected the journey I had been on. As I stood there, surrounded by friends, artists, and supporters, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was both humbling and exhilarating. I had created something beautiful, something lasting, and in doing so I had honored the love, the lessons, and the growth I had experienced. As the evening wound down, I took a quiet moment to step outside, breathing in the cool Paris air. I felt a calmness settle over me, a peace that I hadn't known in years. I looked up at the starlit sky, a soft smile playing on my lips as I remembered Sarah, her laughter, her wisdom, the love we had shared. She was a part of this journey, a part of who I had become, and in some way I knew she would always be with me. In the end, life had led me here, not to a place of perfect happiness or resolution, but to a place of acceptance, of balance. I had loved, I had lost, and I had found a strength within myself that I hadn't known existed. And as I walked back inside, back to the life I had chosen and the future that awaited me, I felt ready for whatever lay ahead. As the Paris gallery settled into its own rhythm, I found myself traveling frequently between Hamburg and Paris, my days filled with meetings, artist collaborations, and endless emails. Each gallery was like a piece of my heart, and I dedicated myself to ensuring that both felt unique, yet connected, like twin expressions of my journey. It was exhausting but invigorating, a reminder of how far I had come and how much I had yet to achieve. Mark, true to his word, became my biggest supporter. He would fly to Paris for openings, help with logistics when I felt overwhelmed, and even took an interest in the artists I was working with. Watching him immerse himself in my world was unexpectedly touching, a reminder that, despite our past troubles, he truly cared for me in his own steadfast way. Yet, even as I moved forward, I couldn't help but feel a quiet, lingering sadness whenever I was in Paris. The city was filled with reminders of Sarah, her letter, her last goodbye, the life she had begun to build here without me. I knew she was out there somewhere, maybe even walking down the same streets, but I resisted the urge to look for her, to reach out. Instead, I allowed her memory to settle into the background, a bittersweet part of me that had shaped who I was, but no longer defined me. One evening, after a long day at the gallery, I wandered through the city streets alone, enjoying the rare freedom of a quiet night. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of autumn leaves, and the streetlights cast a golden glow over the cobblestone roads. I felt an odd sense of tranquility, as if the city itself were comforting me, cradling me in its arms. Eventually, I found myself at a small wine bar tucked away on a quiet side street, one I hadn't visited before. I ordered a glass of red wine and took a seat near the window, watching as people passed by outside, their faces softened by the glow of the streetlights. For the first time in a long while, I felt entirely at peace, grateful for the solitude, for the quiet. But as I sipped my wine, a figure caught my eye. A woman stepping into the bar, her dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders. I felt my heart skip a beat as I recognized her, Sarah. She hadn't seen me yet, and I could only watch, stunned, as she took a seat at the bar, her back to me. Her posture was as graceful as ever, her movements calm and deliberate, yet there was a certain sadness in her that I hadn't seen before, a heaviness that lingered in her gaze. My mind raced with emotions: joy, sadness, confusion, longing. I knew I could get up, walk over to her, and re-enter her life. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. But something stopped me, a quiet realization that we were both here in Paris, both moving forward in our own ways. I wasn't the same woman I had been when we parted, and perhaps she wasn't either. I watched her from a distance, content to let this moment remain unbroken. It felt like closure, like an unspoken understanding between us that we had each taken something meaningful from our time together, something that had allowed us to move on, to grow. I finished my wine, my heart heavy but peaceful, and slipped out of the bar quietly, leaving her untouched by my presence. It felt like a fitting ending, a gentle, respectful farewell that allowed each of us to carry on without reopening old wounds. In the following months, I threw myself into my work with a renewed energy, focusing on an ambitious new project that had been simmering in my mind for years. Inspired by the way Sarah and I had once shared moments of vulnerability and understanding through art, I decided to organize an exhibition dedicated to connections, moments of intimacy, friendship, and human connection that transcend time and distance. I wanted to capture the essence of those fleeting, transformative relationships that linger in our lives, leaving traces even as we move on. I reached out to artists around the world, inviting them to contribute works that spoke to these themes. As the submissions began to arrive, I was struck by the beauty and diversity of the pieces. A pair of hands reaching for each other, painted in soft pastels, a photograph of two women laughing under a rain-soaked sky, an abstract sculpture capturing the quiet melancholy of goodbyes. Each piece seemed to resonate with me on a deeply personal level, a reminder of all the connections that had shaped my life, each one a part of the mosaic of who I was. As the opening night approached, I found myself more nervous than I'd been in years. This exhibition was in many ways my most personal one yet, a reflection of my own journey, of the relationships that had left marks on my heart, of the love and loss that had defined me. I wondered how people would react, whether they would sense the depth of emotion woven into each piece, whether they would understand the quiet story I was trying to tell. The night of the opening, the gallery was filled with an electric energy, the hum of conversation blending with the soft music playing in the background. Mark was by my side, his hand on my back, his presence grounding me. He had been there for every step of the preparation, listening to my ideas, supporting my vision, even helping me set up the final displays. His patience, his understanding had become a constant in my life, a quiet strength that I had come to appreciate more than I ever thought possible. As the evening went on, I moved through the crowd, engaging with visitors, discussing the art, sharing the inspiration behind each piece. There was a warmth in the air, a shared appreciation for the beauty of human connection, and I felt a sense of fulfillment that filled the empty spaces within me. This was what I had always wanted, to create something meaningful, to touch people's lives, to bridge the gaps between hearts, if only for a moment. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd began to thin, I found myself standing in front of a piece I had created, a simple painting of two hands reaching for each other, a gap between them that spoke of both distance and longing. It was a piece that had come from my own heart, a reflection of the love I had once shared with Sarah, the connection that had shaped me, even as it had slipped away. Standing there, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of everything I had been through, of the beauty and the pain that had led me to this moment. Mark joined me, his arms slipping around my waist, his gaze resting on the painting with a thoughtful expression. "It's beautiful," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet admiration. "I can feel the emotion in it, the story it's telling." I looked at him, a smile touching my lips. "Thank you, Mark, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." He turned to me, his eyes soft, a warmth there that took my breath away. "Sophie," he said, his voice gentle, "I don't think I've ever told you how proud I am of you. You've built something truly remarkable, something that brings people together, that touches their lives. I'm lucky to be a part of it." I felt a surge of gratitude, a deep, abiding love for this man who had stood by me, who had weathered the storms of our past and emerged beside me, stronger and more devoted than ever. In that moment, I knew that we had both changed, both grown, and that our love, though different from what I had once imagined, was real, resilient, and true. As we stood together, surrounded by the art that told our story, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. The memories of Sarah, the love we had shared, would always be a part of me, a cherished chapter that had led me to this place. But now, as I looked at Mark, I knew that I had found my way home, to a love built on understanding, on shared dreams, on a future that we were creating together, hand in hand. The gallery lights dimmed as the last guests departed, leaving us in the quiet stillness of the space. I leaned into Mark, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine, and as I closed my eyes, I felt a sense of contentment, a quiet joy that filled me to the brim. I had loved, I had lost, and I had found my way back to myself. And in the end, that was enough. It was everything. As life settled into this new, tranquil rhythm, I found myself savoring moments I might once have overlooked. Mark and I fell into an easy routine of support and shared interests, but it wasn't the predictable life we'd once had. Something had shifted within us both. There was a fresh energy, a tenderness born from all we had weathered together. We would take long walks around the city at night, exchanging quiet reflections on life, on the future, on the art and the people that filled our days. Our conversations deepened, touching on things we had previously avoided, things I would have hesitated to share. One Sunday morning over coffee at a small cafe by the river, Mark surprised me with a question that made my heart skip a beat. "Sophie," he began, swirling his coffee thoughtfully, "have you ever thought about what's next for us? What we want in the coming years?" I looked at him, taken aback. There was an openness in his eyes that felt vulnerable, as though he were inviting me into a deeper layer of his heart, asking me to share my own. I hesitated, then set my coffee down, meeting his gaze. "I think about it all the time," I admitted, "but I'm not always sure what I want. I feel like I'm still discovering parts of myself." He nodded, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "Me too. Think we both are. But maybe we can do that together wherever it leads us." His words filled me with a quiet warmth, a reassurance that we were finally building something that wasn't just about maintaining appearances or fulfilling societal expectations. We were choosing each other day by day in small, meaningful ways. I felt something settle within me, a calmness that allowed me to open up to the unknown. Mark and I were evolving together, finding beauty in the journey, in the simple act of walking side by side as partners in this new chapter of our lives. Inspired by our conversation, I began experimenting more boldly in my personal art. I carved out a space in the gallery, a private studio just for me, where I could work in solitude, away from the business, away from everything that demanded my attention. The studio became a sanctuary, a place where I could be messy, where I could let my thoughts spill onto canvas without judgment. It felt liberating to create for myself, to paint without the pressure of an audience or the expectation of sales. In those quiet hours, as I layered paint and sketched out ideas, I often thought of Sarah. Her memory still lingered, a faint echo that I no longer ran from. She had given me the courage to embrace my own desires, to take risks, to live openly. And now I could honor that part of my past without longing or regret. I had made my peace with it. One evening, after a particularly intense day in the studio, I stood back and looked at the painting I had been working on. A swirling abstract, a riot of color and movement. It was a piece that reflected everything I had been through, a story of love, loss, resilience, and transformation. It was raw, unfiltered, deeply personal, and for the first time I felt ready to share it with the world. I decided to feature it as the centerpiece in a new exhibition at the gallery, titled Becoming. The theme was transformation, evolution, the journey of self-discovery that each of us embarks on at various points in life. I invited artists from diverse backgrounds to contribute works that explored similar themes, creating a rich tapestry of stories told through art. The night of the opening was unlike any I had ever experienced. Friends, family, artists, and patrons filled the gallery, their conversations mingling with the music, laughter, and excitement in the air. There was a palpable energy, an anticipation that I hadn't felt before. As people moved through the gallery studying each piece, I found myself observing them, curious to see how they reacted to the works, to the emotions that had been poured into every stroke, every sculpture, every photograph. Mark stood by my side throughout the evening, his hand occasionally finding mine, his quiet presence grounding me. I could see the pride in his eyes as he watched people engage with the art, as he listened to the snippets of conversation that filled the space. And then as I turned, I caught sight of someone in the crowd, someone who made my heart stop for a beat. It was Sarah. She stood near one of the paintings, her gaze soft, her posture relaxed as she took in the art around her. I hadn't expected to see her, hadn't even known if she still followed my work. But there she was, a part of this moment, a part of the journey I was sharing with the world. Our eyes met across the room, and in that instant it felt as if time slowed, as if everything else faded away. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gentle smile that conveyed 1,000 unspoken words. There was no bitterness, no unresolved longing, only a quiet acknowledgement of everything we had been to each other, and everything we had left behind. As the evening continued, she drifted closer, and at one point, I found myself standing beside her, the sounds of the gallery buzzing around us like a comforting hum. "Sarah," I said, my voice soft, a smile touching my lips. "I didn't expect to see you here." She returned my smile, her eyes warm, genuine. "I wouldn't have missed it," she replied, her gaze flickering over the paintings. "This is incredible, Sophie. I'm so proud of you." Her words filled me with a quiet pride, a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I owe so much of this to you. You helped me find myself." She reached out, giving my hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm glad I could be a part of your journey, even if it was only for a moment. You're remarkable, Sophie. Don't ever forget that." I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, a surge of gratitude filling my heart. This woman who had once been my entire world had become a cherished memory, a source of strength and inspiration that I would carry with me always. We had loved, we had lost, but we had grown, each in our own way. And in that growth I found a sense of peace, a quiet, enduring joy. As the night wore on, Sarah and I parted ways, a final loving goodbye that held no sadness, only mutual respect and gratitude. I watched her go, feeling lighter than I had in years, knowing that this chapter of my life had come full circle. When the evening finally wound down, Mark and I left the gallery hand in hand, stepping into the cool night air. We walked in silence, a comfortable, easy silence that felt as intimate as any conversation. I looked over at him, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights, and felt a swell of love, a warmth that filled every corner of my heart. He turned to me, his eyes soft, a small smile playing on his lips. "Tonight was amazing, Sophie. You did something extraordinary." "Thank you," I murmured, leaning into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I couldn't have done it without you." And as we walked home together, I knew that my journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new dreams to pursue, new moments of love and discovery. But now I faced the future with a sense of wholeness, of strength, of peace. I had found my way back to myself, to the life I was meant to live. A life built on love, resilience, and the quiet, enduring beauty of human connection. In the end, my story wasn't about a single love or a single loss, but about the journey of becoming, of embracing each chapter, each person, each lesson along the way. And as I looked toward the future, I knew with every fiber of my being that I was ready for whatever lay ahead.